The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the San Diego, California railway station, and Victoria Pennington stepped down onto the dusty street with a carpetbag clutched in trembling hands, and a bruise blooming purple and black across her left eye like a storm cloud had settled there permanently. She had traveled 3,000 miles from Boston to marry a man she had never met, a rancher named Gerald Morrison, who had written her beautiful letters filled with promises of a gentle life under California sunshine. Those letters had been lies. When she arrived at his ranch 2 days ago, he had taken one look at her pale skin and red hair and sneered that she was not the beauty he had expected. The first blow came when she politely asked about the sleeping arrangements. The second came when she flinched away from his reaching hands. She had escaped in the night, stealing his horse and riding hard toward San Diego with nothing but the clothes on her back and $17 sewn into her petticoat hem. The horse had thrown a shoe 5 miles outside of town, and she had walked the rest of the way as dawn broke over the Pacific Ocean, that vast blue expanse she had only read about in books. Now she stood in the afternoon heat, exhausted and terrified, wondering if Gerald Morrison would come looking for his property. That was how he had referred to her, his property. She needed to find work, a place to hide, anything that would keep her from being dragged back to that isolated ranch where no one could hear her scream. The town bustled around her with activity. Cowboys drove cattle through the streets, their voices carrying Spanish and English in equal measure. Women in bright-colored dresses walked with parasols to shield them from the relentless sun. The smell of the ocean mixed with dust and horse and cooking meat from somewhere nearby. Victoria approached a woman sweeping the porch of a boarding house, her voice barely above a whisper. "Excuse me, madam, I am looking for work, any kind of work." The woman looked at her black eye and her dusty dress and shook her head quickly. "No trouble here. Move along." She tried the general store next, then a restaurant, then a seamstress shop. Each time the response was the same. No one wanted to hire a woman who looked like she had been in a fight, a woman who might bring violence to their doorstep. Victoria felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. She had not cried when Gerald hit her, and she would not cry now. The sun was sinking lower when she found herself outside the Silver Spur Saloon. Music drifted through the swinging doors along with the sound of laughter and glasses clicking together. She knew what kind of work saloons offered women, and desperation warred with pride in her chest. She was about to turn away when a man emerged from the building, tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of the sky just before night fell. He stopped when he saw her, his gaze moving from her face to the carpetbag in her hand. "You look lost." "I am looking for work," Victoria said, lifting her chin despite the way her voice shook. "Respectable work." His eyes locked on her bruised face and something shifted in his expression. The casual friendliness vanished, replaced by something colder and harder than winter steel. "Where is he?" His voice went cold, each word precise and sharp as a knife blade. Victoria took a step backward. "I do not know what you mean." "The man who put that mark on your face." He gestured toward her eye. "Where is he?" She could lie, she should lie. But there was something in his face that made her want to tell the truth, a quality she could not quite name. "A ranch, north of here, I left." "Good." He studied her for a long moment, then seemed to come to some decision. "My name is James Fitzgerald. I run a horse ranch about 3 miles east of town. My housekeeper quit last week to marry a miner heading to Nevada. The job is yours if you want it. Room and board included, $30 a month." Victoria stared at him, certain she had misheard. "You do not know me." "I know enough." James turned toward the hitching post, where a magnificent bay gelding waited. You can ride behind me or I can rent a wagon, but we should leave before dark. The road gets dangerous after sunset. Why are you helping me?" He swung into the saddle with easy grace, then looked down at her with those blue eyes that seemed to see straight through all her careful defenses. "Because someone should have helped my sister when she needed it, but no one did. She died running from a man who thought he owned her. I will not watch another woman suffer the same fate if I can prevent it." The words struck Victoria like a physical blow. She saw grief in the hard lines of his face, old pain that had settled into his bones and changed him. She made her decision. "I can ride behind you." James reached down and pulled her up with surprising gentleness, settling her on the horse behind him. "Hold on tight." Victoria wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him through his shirt, and they rode out of San Diego as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. The Fitzgerald Ranch appeared as twilight settled over the land, a sprawling property with a neat two-story house painted white, a large barn, and several corrals where horses moved like shadows in the fading light. James helped her down and carried her carpetbag to the house without being asked. Inside, the house was clean but clearly lacking a woman's touch. Dishes sat stacked by the sink, and dust covered most of the surfaces. James led her up the stairs to a small bedroom with a window overlooking the corrals. "This was my sister's room. You can have it." Victoria set her carpetbag on the narrow bed. "What was her name?" "Sarah." He said it quietly like a prayer. "She was 19 when she died. That was 5 years ago. I am sorry for your loss." James nodded once, then cleared his throat. "I will be straight with you, Miss Pennington. I need someone to keep the house, cook meals, and help with the ranch accounts. I'm not looking for anything else. You will be safe here. If the man from that ranch comes looking for you, he will have to go through me first." "Why would you risk that for a stranger?" "Because it is the right thing to do." He moved toward the door. "Get some rest. We can discuss your duties in the morning." Victoria barely remembered undressing and climbing into bed. She fell asleep instantly, exhausted by fear and travel, and the strange mercy of a cowboy who looked at her bruised face and offered sanctuary instead of judgment. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of horses whinnying in the corrals below. For a moment she forgot where she was, panic rising in her throat until she remembered. Safe. She was safe. Victoria dressed quickly and made her way downstairs to find James already gone. A note on the kitchen table read, "Help yourself to breakfast. I am working with the horses." His handwriting was neat and precise, just like everything else about him. She spent the morning cleaning, scrubbing dishes and sweeping floors and beating the dust from curtains that had not been washed in months. The work felt good, purposeful. It reminded her of home, of the life she had lived before her father died and left her penniless, before she had answered Gerald Morrison's advertisement for a bride. James came in at noon, sweat staining his shirt and dust coating his boots. He stopped in the doorway, looking around at the transformed kitchen with something like wonder. "You did not have to do all this in one day. I wanted to earn my keep." Victoria ladled stew into a bowl and set it on the table. She had found vegetables in the root cellar and beef in the cold box, and cooking had always soothed her nerves. "I hope you do not mind that I used your supplies. This is your home now. Use whatever you need." James sat and ate with the focused efficiency of a man who viewed food as fuel rather than pleasure. After a few bites, he paused. "This is excellent. Best meal I have had in months." Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Thank you." They fell into a routine over the following days. James worked with the horses from dawn until dusk, training them for buyers who came from as far as Los Angeles and Sacramento. Victoria kept the house and cooked, and slowly began to understand the account books he left for her to review. She had a head for numbers, something her father had encouraged despite her mother's protests that arithmetic was unladylike. She learned that James was 26 and had inherited the ranch from his father 3 years ago. He was respected in town, known for his fair dealing and his skill with horses. People called him stern but honest, a man who kept his word no matter the cost. She also learned that he was lonely. She saw it in the way he lingered over dinner, in how he asked her questions about Boston and her life before California. He never touched her, never even stood too close, but she felt the connection growing between them like a vine reaching for sunlight. A week after her arrival, Victoria was hanging laundry when she saw a rider approaching from the west. Her hands stilled on the wet sheet and cold fear washed through her. She recognized that horse. She recognized that hat. Gerald Morrison. She dropped the laundry basket and ran for the barn, calling James's name. He appeared from one of the stalls, took one look at her face, and reached for the rifle mounted on the wall. "Stay inside," he ordered, his voice carrying the same cold quality it had held when he first saw her bruise. "He will hurt you. He will try." James checked the rifle and started for the door. "Go into the house and lock the door. Do not come out until I tell you." Victoria wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her. She ran for the house, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. From the window, she watched Gerald dismount in the yard, his face red with rage. "You have something that belongs to me," Gerald shouted. "Send her out." James stood on the porch, rifle held loosely in his hands. "Miss Pennington is an employee of mine. She does not belong to anyone. She is my bride. I paid for her passage from Boston. Did she marry you?" Gerald faltered. "We were meant to marry." "That is not the same thing." James descended the porch steps slowly, his movements controlled and dangerous. "You put your hands on her. You marked her face. Now you need to leave my property. I want what is mine. She is not yours. She never was." James raised the rifle, not quite pointing it at Gerald but making his intentions clear. "You have 10 seconds to mount that horse and ride away. If I ever see you near my ranch or near Miss Pennington again, I will not be so polite." Victoria pressed her hand against the window glass, terrified and mesmerized. Gerald was larger than James, heavier, with the look of a man who enjoyed violence. But James stood his ground, steady as stone. Gerald spat into the dust. "You think you are protecting her? She is nothing but a lying whore. She promised to marry me and then ran like a thief in the night. Because you beat her." James's voice dropped even lower. "Get on your horse. Make me." It happened faster than Victoria could follow. Gerald lunged forward and James swung the rifle, catching him across the jaw with the stock. Gerald went down hard, blood streaming from his mouth. Before he could rise, James had the rifle barrel pressed against his chest. "I am only going to say this once," James said, and his voice was colder than Victoria had ever heard it. "If you come back here, if you try to hurt her, if you so much as speak her name in town, I will kill you. That is not a threat. That is a promise. Do you understand me?" Gerald nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "Good. Now get up and ride away before I change my mind about letting you leave at all." Gerald scrambled to his feet and mounted his horse with shaking hands. He looked toward the house, and Victoria stepped back from the window, her heart in her throat. Then he wheeled the horse around and galloped away, leaving a trail of dust in his wake. James stood in the yard until Gerald disappeared from sight, then lowered the rifle and turned toward the house. Victoria met him at the door, and without thinking, she threw her arms around him. "You could have been killed," she whispered against his chest. His arms came around her slowly, carefully, like he was afraid she might break. "I told you I would keep you safe." They stood like that for a long moment, and Victoria felt something shift between them, some invisible barrier crumbling. When she pulled back, she saw her own feelings reflected in his eyes. "Thank you," she said. James touched her face, his fingers gentle against the fading bruise. "You never have to thank me for doing what is right." That night, they sat on the porch together watching the stars emerge one by one across the vast California sky. The ocean was close enough that Victoria could hear the distant sound of waves, a constant rhythm that reminded her how far she had traveled from everything she had known. "You miss Boston?" James asked. "I miss what Boston represented, security, family, but those things were gone before I left." She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "My father was a professor at Harvard. When he died, I discovered he had debts I knew nothing about. Everything was sold to pay his creditors. I had nowhere to go and no prospects. Answering that advertisement seemed like my only option. I am sorry you had to make that choice. So am I. But if I had not, I would never have met you." The words came out before she could stop them, bold and honest in the darkness. James was quiet for so long that Victoria thought she had made a terrible mistake. Then he reached over and took her hand, his palm warm and calloused against hers. "I am glad you are here, Victoria. I want you to know that, not just because you keep an excellent house or because you can cook better than anyone I have ever met. I am glad because you are here." Her heart felt too large for her chest. "I am glad too." They sat like that until the moon rose, hands clasped together, and Victoria thought this might be what happiness felt like. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of something strong enough to stand against it. The weeks turned into months, and summer ripened into autumn. Victoria's bruise faded completely, leaving no trace except in her memory. She grew strong working on the ranch, her pale Boston skin turning golden under the California sun. James taught her to ride properly, to handle a horse with confidence, and she taught him that a house could be more than just a place to sleep between days of work. They learned each other slowly, carefully, like people who had both been burned and were cautious around fire. James told her about his sister, how she had fallen in love with a gambler who turned violent after they married, how she had tried to leave, and he had found her on the road and beat her to death. How James had tracked the man down and turned him over to the law, even though every fiber of his being had wanted revenge. Victoria told him about her mother, who had been cruel in small ways, always criticizing and never satisfied. About her father, who had been kind but distant, more concerned with his books than his daughter. About how she had felt invisible her entire life until she stepped off that stagecoach and James had really seen her. The ranch prospered. James's horses were known throughout California for their quality and temperament. Buyers came regularly, and Victoria helped negotiate prices, her sharp mind for numbers proving invaluable. They were a good team, everyone said so, but Victoria wanted more than a partnership. She was in love with James Fitzgerald, had been since the moment he asked, "Where is he?" with murder in his eyes and protection in his heart. She saw the way he looked at her when he thought she was not watching, the way he found excuses to be near her, the way his voice gentled when he spoke her name. But he never crossed the careful line they had drawn between employer and employee. It was November when everything changed. Victoria was baking bread when James came in from the corrals, his face troubled. "What is wrong?" she asked immediately. "I received a telegram from Sacramento. A buyer wants to purchase 20 horses, but he needs them delivered before winter. It is a week's journey each way. I will have to hire help to drive them north. When do you leave?" "3 days. He sat at the table, running a hand through his hair. "I do not like leaving you alone. I will be fine. Gerald has not returned. I do not think he will." It is not just him. There are drifters, outlaws. This is still rough country. Victoria wiped flour from her hands and sat across from him. I can handle a rifle. You taught me yourself, and I will ask Mrs. Chen from town to stay with me if it would ease your mind. James looked at her, and she saw everything he was not saying written across his face. Victoria, I need to tell you something before I leave. Her breath caught. Yes. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. These past months have been the happiest of my life. You have made this house a home. You have made me remember what it feels like to look forward to tomorrow. I know I have no right to ask. I know the circumstances that brought you here were terrible, but I need you to know that I love you. I have loved you since the day you stepped off that stagecoach with fire in your eyes despite everything you had endured. If you do not feel the same, I will never mention it again, but I could not leave without telling you the truth. Victoria felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, they were tears of joy. I love you too. I have loved you for so long I cannot remember when it started. Maybe the moment you offered me sanctuary. Maybe the moment you stood up to Gerald. Maybe it was gradual, like watching the sun rise. But James, I love you with everything I am. He stood and pulled her to her feet, his hands framing her face like she was something precious and breakable. May I kiss you, please? She whispered. His lips met hers softly, carefully, a question and an answer all at once. Victoria melted against him, and the kiss deepened, months of longing and restraint finally given freedom. When they broke apart, both breathless, James rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, he said. Not because you need protection or a home, but because I want to spend every day of the rest of my life loving you. Marry me, Victoria. Yes, she laughed and cried at the same time. Yes, 1,000 times yes. They married 2 days later in a small church in San Diego with Mrs. Chen and her husband as witnesses. Victoria wore a simple blue dress and carried wildflowers that James had picked that morning. There was no grand celebration, no elaborate ceremony. Just two people promising to love and cherish each other before God and the handful of friends they had made in California. That night, in the room that had once been Sarah's and was now theirs, James held Victoria close and whispered all the dreams he had never dared to speak aloud. Children running through the house, growing old together, building something that would last beyond their lifetime. Victoria listened and added her own dreams to his, and for the first time since her father died, she felt completely at peace. James left for Sacramento 3 days later with his hired hands and 20 of the finest horses California had ever produced. He kissed Victoria goodbye in the pale dawn light and promised to return within 2 weeks. I will count every hour until you come home, she told him. As will I. She watched him ride away until he disappeared over the horizon, then turned back to the ranch that was now fully, completely hers. Their home. The days passed slowly without James. Victoria kept busy with the daily work of maintaining the ranch. She fed the remaining horses, cleaned stalls, repaired a section of fence that had come loose. Mrs. Chen came to visit twice, bringing gossip from town and staying for tea. Victoria was grateful for the company, but mostly she just missed her husband. It was the 10th day when the visitors came. Victoria was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard horses approaching. Her first thought was that James had returned early, but when she looked out the window, her blood turned to ice. 5 men on horseback, rough-looking and armed. She recognized the type, even if she did not recognize their faces. Outlaws, drifters, men who took what they wanted without caring about the consequences. Victoria grabbed the rifle from above the door and checked that it was loaded. Her hands were steady even though her heart pounded. She had not survived Gerald Morrison just to fall victim to random thieves. The leader knocked on the door, and Victoria answered with the rifle pointed directly at his chest. "This is private property. You need to leave." He smiled, showing yellowed teeth. "Now that is not very hospitable. We have been riding all day, just looking for a meal and maybe a place to rest. There is a boarding house in San Diego, 3 miles west. That is an awful long way to go when there is a nice house right here." His eyes traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Pretty thing like you should not be alone. Where is your husband? He will be back any moment. I suggest you leave before he arrives." The man laughed. "I do not think so. I think you are here all by yourself with no one to protect you." Victoria cocked the rifle. "I do not need anyone to protect me. I am giving you one chance to leave peacefully. After that, I start shooting." His smile vanished. "You would not dare. Try me." For a long moment they stared at each other. Then he raised his hand and Victoria saw the other men reaching for their weapons. She fired. The shot went wide deliberately, close enough to the leader's head that he flinched and his horse danced sideways. Before he could recover, she cocked the rifle again, the sound loud in the sudden silence. "The next one does not miss," she said coldly. "Get off my property." Whether it was the steadiness of her hands or the look in her eyes or simply the calculation that one woman was not worth the risk of getting shot, the men decided to leave. The leader spat into the dust and wheeled his horse around. "This is not over," he called back. "Yes, it is," Victoria replied, and fired another shot over their heads to punctuate her point. She watched until they disappeared, then locked every door and window in the house. She sat up all night with the rifle across her lap, but the men did not return. When James rode into the yard 2 days later with the sun high overhead, Victoria was cleaning her rifle on the porch. She set it aside and ran to meet him, throwing herself into his arms before he could fully dismount. "I missed you," she said against his chest, breathing in the familiar smell of him, horse and leather and sage. "I missed you too." He pulled back, studying her face with concern. "What happened? You look exhausted." Victoria told him about the outlaws, about how she had faced them down and driven them away. With each word, James's expression grew darker. "You could have been killed," he said when she finished. "But I was not. You taught me well. I never should have left you alone, James." She cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "I am not fragile. I am not helpless. I faced down those men because I refused to be a victim ever again. You gave me that strength, but I cannot live my life in fear, and neither can you." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. "I cannot lose you, not after finding you. You will not lose me. We will protect each other as we always have." James kissed her then, hard and desperate, pouring all his fear and relief into the contact. When they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "No more trips without you. From now on, we stay together." "I would like that." They kept that promise. Over the following years, they traveled together whenever business demanded it, to Sacramento and Los Angeles, and even once to San Francisco for a horse auction. Victoria became known in her own right as a shrewd negotiator and an expert in bloodlines and training. Together, they built the Fitzgerald Ranch into one of the most respected horse operations in California. But more than business success, they built a life. A real life, full of small joys and daily tenderness. James brought Victoria coffee in bed every morning. Victoria left notes in his saddlebag when he had to ride out to check on the herds. They danced in the kitchen while dinner cooked. They sat on the porch every evening and watched the sun set over the Pacific. They also faced hardships. A bad drought one summer that killed half their hay crop. A winter storm that damaged the barn and took weeks to repair. The death of James's favorite horse, a stallion named Thunder who had been with him since he was a boy. But they faced everything together, and that made all the difference. 2 years after their marriage, Victoria discovered she was pregnant. She told James over dinner, simply and without ceremony. "We are going to have a baby." He stared at her for a long moment, then let out a whoop of joy that probably echoed all the way to San Diego. He swept her up in his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to stop before she got dizzy. "A baby," he kept repeating. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes, my love, in about 6 months if the doctor's calculations are correct." James knelt beside her chair and placed his hand on her still flat stomach. Thank you for giving me this gift. We made this together." Victoria threaded her fingers through his hair. "You are going to be a wonderful father." The pregnancy was difficult. Victoria suffered terrible sickness in the early months, and the final weeks left her swollen and uncomfortable. James hovered constantly, driving her to distraction with his concern. But she loved him for it, for the way he cared so deeply and so openly. Their son was born on a warm April morning in 1878, arriving with a powerful set of lungs and a shock of dark hair. James cried when he held his child for the first time, tears streaming down his face as he counted tiny fingers and toes. "What should we name him?" Victoria asked from the bed, exhausted but radiant. "Thomas," James said immediately. "After your father, Thomas Fitzgerald." Victoria started crying too, overwhelmed by the generosity of the gesture. Her father had not been perfect, but he had loved her in his way, and giving his name to their son felt like forgiveness and healing all at once. Thomas was a happy baby who grew into an adventurous toddler. He loved the horses, showing James's natural talent from an early age. By the time he was 3, he could sit a horse by himself, and was already learning the basics of training. When Thomas was 4, Victoria became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and their daughter arrived without complications. They named her Sarah, after James's lost sister, and James held his daughter with trembling hands while tears fell onto her blanket. "She would have loved this," he whispered. "She would have loved you." "She does love us," Victoria said softly. "I am certain of it." Sarah grew into a fierce, intelligent girl with her mother's red hair and her father's blue eyes. She kept her older brother in line and showed an early aptitude for numbers that delighted Victoria. By the time she was 6, she was helping with the ranch accounts, her small hand carefully writing figures in neat columns. The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. The ranch continued to prosper. Thomas grew tall and strong, eventually taking over much of the day-to-day horse training. Sarah developed a talent for breeding, understanding bloodlines and genetics in a way that impressed even the most experienced ranchers. Victoria and James grew older together, their hair turning gray, their faces gaining lines from years of sun and laughter. But their love never diminished. If anything, it deepened, becoming richer and more complex with each passing season. On their 20th anniversary, James took Victoria on a trip to San Francisco. They stayed in a fancy hotel and attended the opera and ate in restaurants where the prices made them both wince even though they could easily afford it. It was wonderful and strange, being reminded of the civilized world they had left behind. But on the train ride home, Victoria looked at James across the compartment and felt nothing but gratitude that their lives were in California on that ranch, with their children and their horses and the endless ocean wind. "Have you been happy?" James asked suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. "Every single day," Victoria replied honestly. "Even the hard ones, especially the hard ones because we faced them together." "I think about that day you stepped off the stagecoach," James said quietly. How close you came to disappearing into that ranch with Gerald Morrison. How easily we might have never met. But we did meet. You saved me. No. He reached across and took her hand. You saved yourself. You were brave enough to run, strong enough to survive. All I did was give you a safe place to land. You gave me everything. Victoria moved to sit beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. A home, a family, a life worth living. You gave me love when I thought I would never deserve it. You always deserved it, always. They sat like that for the rest of the journey, watching California roll past the windows, and Victoria thought about the strange paths that life took. How tragedy and mercy could exist in the same moment. How a black eye and a cold voice asking, "Where is he?" had led to 2 decades of happiness. She thought about the girl she had been, desperate and afraid, stepping off that stagecoach with nothing but hope and determination. She barely recognized that girl now. Life had transformed her, hardened her in some ways and softened her in others. But mostly, love had transformed her. James's love, steady and sure and always present. When they arrived home, Thomas and Sarah were waiting with a celebration dinner they had prepared themselves. The food was slightly burned and the table decorations were crooked, but it was perfect. Their whole life was perfect, not because it lacked hardship, but because they faced everything together. Years continued to pass. Thomas married a rancher's daughter from Los Angeles, a smart woman named Margaret who fit seamlessly into the family. They gave Victoria and James 3 grandchildren who ran wild through the ranch, just as their father had before them. Sarah married later, to a horse buyer from Sacramento named Robert who appreciated her sharp mind and fierce independence. They had twin girls who showed promise of inheriting their mother's gift with numbers, and their grandfather's way with horses. Victoria and James grew old surrounded by love and laughter. The ranch remained in the family, passed down from generation to generation, each one adding their own improvements while maintaining the core of what James and Victoria had built together. On a warm summer evening in 1898, when Victoria was 63 and James was 68, they sat on the same porch where they had first held hands 20 years earlier. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, and the sound of their grandchildren playing drifted from the barn. "Do you have any regrets?" Victoria asked, the same question James had posed all those years ago on the train. "Not a single one." James squeezed her hand. "You." "Only that we cannot live this life over and over again, experiencing it fresh each time. Once is enough. Once is everything." Victoria leaned her head on his shoulder, and they watched the sun sink below the horizon. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from Boston to San Diego, from fear to love, from brokenness to wholeness. She thought about the moment she stepped off that stagecoach with a black eye and a carpetbag, not knowing that her real life was about to begin. She thought about James, her stern cowboy with the gentle heart, who had taken one look at her bruised face and decided she was worth protecting. Who had given her not just shelter but partnership, not just safety but passion, not just a home but a future. Most of all, she thought about love. Real love, the kind that endured through droughts and storms, through hardship and joy, through all the ordinary moments that made up a life. The kind of love that asked, "Where is he?" with ice in its voice, and then spent 20 years proving that love could be warm and constant and true. Thomas came up to the porch with his eldest son on his shoulders. "Mother, father, dinner is ready." "We will be right there," James said, but neither of them moved. They sat a moment longer, hands clasped, watching stars begin to emerge in the darkening sky. Then James stood and helped Victoria to her feet, and together they walked inside to join their family. The house was full of noise and warmth and love. Sarah was arguing with Robert about whether to expand the breeding program. Margaret was trying to convince one of the twins to eat her vegetables. The children were running in circles, their laughter echoing off the walls. Victoria stood in the doorway of the dining room, taking it all in, committing every detail to memory. This was what she had dreamed of on that long journey from Boston, even though she had not known how to name it then. This sense of belonging, this feeling of being exactly where she was meant to be. James came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" "Everything," Victoria said softly. "Nothing. How lucky we are. The luckiest people in the world." They joined their family around the table that Victoria had scrubbed clean on her first morning at the ranch. The same table where James had first eaten her cooking, where he had held her hands and told her he loved her, where they had celebrated births and mourned deaths, and lived their entire life in the space between. As dinner conversation swirled around them, as grandchildren begged for stories and Thomas discussed plans for next year's breeding season, and Sarah calculated projected profits, Victoria caught James's eye across the table. He smiled at her, that same smile he had given her 20 years ago when she had told him she loved him, and she smiled back. No words were needed. They had said everything that mattered 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways. "I love you. I choose you. I will always choose you." After dinner, after the grandchildren had been tucked into bed and Thomas and Sarah and their spouses had retired to their own homes on the property, Victoria and James walked out to the barn. The horses nickered softly as they passed, familiar presences in the darkness. They climbed the ladder to the hayloft, something they had done countless times over the years. The sweet smell of hay surrounded them, and through the open doors, they could see the moon rising over the Pacific. "Remember when we used to come up here when the children were small," James said. "Our one place to be alone. I remember everything." Victoria settled against him, his arm around her shoulders. "Every moment we have shared. Good, hold onto those memories. Never let them go." They stayed there for hours, talking about the past and the future, about their children and grandchildren, about the ranch and the horses, and everything they had built together. When they finally climbed down and walked back to the house, the moon was high overhead, and the world was wrapped in silver light. In their bedroom, the room that had once belonged to Sarah, and now held 20 years of their married life, James helped Victoria undress with the same careful tenderness he had shown on their wedding night. They lay down together and he pulled her close, her back against his chest, his arm secure around her waist. "I love you," he whispered into her hair. "I love you too. Forever." They fell asleep like that, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a love that would outlast them both. In the morning, they would wake and start another day, feeding horses and reviewing accounts and living the ordinary, extraordinary life they had created. But for now, they simply held each other, grateful for every moment, every breath, every heartbeat that they had been given together. The mail-order bride with the black eye and the cowboy who had asked, "Where is he?" with death in his voice had found something neither of them expected. They had found home. They had found peace. They had found forever. And in the quiet darkness of that California night, with the sound of the ocean in the distance and the warmth of their love surrounding them like a blessing, that was more than enough. It was everything.